Chapter 10 I knew that things were changing when I set eyes on our new set after we returned from Europe in June of 1976. The money was flowing in, and Bill was funneling some of it right back into the show. I have to admit that I loved the two huge emerald-eyed cats that sat on either side of my drums. But the rest of the staging was a mess. They built a gothic castle for Gene to be a monster in. The spaceman got his own lunar landscape. There was a modified Tesla coil that was supposed to shoot out electricity during God of Thunder, but it seldom worked. Neither did the tentacle tree that was supposed to undulate its branches. "This fucking set looks like a fruit salad," Ace said. "I thought it was more like Disneyland." We wound up getting rid of half of it. Just as the set had changed, so did the people who were responsible for the show itself. The changes started at the top. Bill was seldom out on the road with us. When he did come out, he'd take us all to dinner and then stand on the side of the stage and gloat over us. We felt like kids showing off for their dad. But those visits were so far and few between that we began calling him Good Gig Gooey. Gooey was his nickname, because he had a tendency to only show up to the larger, most prestigious gigs. Bill decided that we needed our own business managers. He reached out to Howard Marks and Carl Glickman. Marks had worked with Bill for years and had an active hand in mediating the royalty disputes with Neil Bogart. Glickman was a real estate mogul from Cleveland who had experience in turning around companies on the verge of bankruptcy. He also seemed to have friends who were connected. One of those guys was rumored to have acquired a small percentage of ownership in Kiss, since he had provided Bill with a bridge loan to keep him afloat before all the royalties from the Alive album kicked in. Then Marks and Glickman began flexing their own muscle. Most of our original crew got 86. J.R. Moosey, Monroe, all gone, all replaced by Marks and Glickman's people. Overnight, we weren't a rock and roll band anymore. We had become a big business. All the heart and soul and spontaneity had gone out the door when Marks and Glickman took over. I loved Bill to death and I never want to badmouth him in any way, but I think a lot of the problems we were facing were due to the coke clouding his judgment. Bill had been the hands-on arbiter of any disputes in the band in the early days. At the end of every week, "I want all four of you to sit in one room and hash out whatever is bothering you," Bill would tell us. And we did that for quite a while. Each guy would bring up what was bugging him about the others and we'd discuss it and say we'd change and then we'd all shake on it. But we got away from that. Now there were all these new people around us, and they weren't loyal people who had been through wars with us. Howard Marks didn't know a fucking thing about running a band. All these guys were businessmen. Bill knew us backward and forward, but the coke was making him paranoid. The only upside to the personnel changes was that we hired the greatest road manager we would ever have. Frankie LaRocka was an incredibly endearing Italian, a roly-poly guy around 5'6" with a beard and a razor-cut haircut. He was a veteran of the road, having taken Alice Cooper out for years. Frankie was tougher than any one of us, for sure. He had a way with words that was unrivaled, so it was never a good idea to try to out-jab him. He was the why man. He'd preface all his comments with why. If Paul had been giving him a hard time, he'd zero in. "Why, you don't wish you could grow a pussy overnight, next to your cock? Why, we don't make little titties when we go in the shower." "Fuck you, Fat Frankie," Paul would counter. "I may be fat, but I please all the girls. My dick's not big, but I can make it spin. Can you?" Frankie gave all of us nicknames. He thought Paul's nickname, he/she, was perfect, so he didn't change that. Ace was high octane because he was bombed most of the time. Or Scraps, because he ate whatever was left over on everybody's plates. He called me either Peter Luong, because I would complain all the time, or the Ayatollah Criss because of my imperious attitude. Jean was Jean the Nazarene because he thought he was God's gift to the world. Frankie's greatest salvos were always aimed at Jean. Jean actually had the balls to ask all of us to refer to him as God. He was dead serious. If I said something as mundane as "Gee, it's a beautiful day today," Jean would say, "Yes, I think I'll leave it that way." So Frankie would go up to Jean and say, "I'm going to sit next to God. Is it okay for me to be near your presence, Sir Jean?" Jean would say yes. "Oh, thank you so much for talking to me," Frankie would say, actually bowing and scraping. "I feel so honored, I can't wait to be like you when I grow up." How could you not love a guy like that who has the balls to put you in your rightful place? He made a jerk out of me many, many times, but I loved him. We all loved him. He would always say, "What? Who's better than us?" Frankie would always scam the promoters. Every place we played, he would tell them that it was one of our birthdays that night. "Hey, it's Peter's birthday tonight. Can you make something happen? You know, some women. Some champagne?" Sure enough, after the show I'd walk into the dressing room and all these people would be singing happy birthday and I'd look all surprised. Frankie worked the hotel managers as well. One time Ace and I tore a hotel room door off its hinges. When the angry manager came up to complain, Frankie got irate, blamed it on crazy fans who found out our room numbers, and castigated the hotel security. One time Ace destroyed his room and the cops were on their way over, so Frankie had Ace lie under the covers and told the cops that Ace had passed out and that it angered the people he was partying with so much that they threw all his furniture out the window. I think Bill got a little jealous of Frankie. By then we had started chartering our own little private planes. One day Jean told me that Frankie was getting fired for taking kickbacks on the plane fees. I didn't buy that at all. I think he was set up and they got rid of him because he got too close to the band. I got together with Frankie quite a few times after he got canned. We'd go for drinks and he'd say, "Peter, I never stole any of your money. I loved you guys. I gave you everything I had. Those guys were full of shit." I believed him. Frankie died years after that. I cried in my room when I heard the news. We hit the road with our new show on July 3rd in Norfolk, Virginia. It didn't take 2 dates before we had our first crisis. On July 8th in Richmond, a fan threw a live M80 firecracker that landed on my drum riser and exploded with such force that it literally blew me off my drums. My drum tech had to cushion my fall and we both went down. Then I couldn't hear a thing. They stopped the show and threw me into an ambulance and checked me out. We came right back to the venue, but I was reluctant to finish the show. Sean would have none of that. "You fucking go out there and you tell them, fuck this, the cat has 9 motherfucking lives. And then go right into a drum solo." I did just what Sean said, and the crowd went crazy. The noise was so deafening it felt like the walls of the Colosseum would come tumbling down. The guys joined me at the end of the solo, and it was such a rush. 2 days later, we were back in the metropolitan area. We were playing Roosevelt Stadium in Jersey City. It was a real shithole. But we did have a great after-show party, and Linda Lovelace of Deep Throat fame showed up. Of course everyone wanted a blowjob from her, but it never happened. This was the show where we met our new business manager's tour liaison, Criss. Criss was a recent business school graduate, a real clean, cut straight guy. It didn't take us long to corrupt him. Criss and I got along real well. One of the first things I had him do was go with me to Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. That's where my grandmother Clara was resting. Clara. had been my second mother. I had undying love for her. She worked her ass off at 3 jobs to help support my family, all the time keeping the house where she and I lived clean and hospitable. She was my hero. One Sunday night when I came home from a date, she was watching Lawrence Welk as usual, but she was having a little scotch. She never drank scotch before. She was a beer drinker, but her doctor told her that she should switch to scotch now and then since she was a diabetic and there was no sugar in scotch. Now you know why I hated doctors then. I went to my room that night and lay in the bed, and then I heard a thumping noise. I went into the living room and she was on the floor, unable to get up. I thought she had died and I ran to my mom's house and she came back and we called an ambulance. Clara had taken a diabetic stroke. She couldn't talk after that, she couldn't walk. So my parents took her in and they had to feed her and wash her and give her insulin injections. It killed me to see her like that. She was such a strong woman. She was indestructible in my eyes. This was the woman who raised me, put the coats on my back, and helped me through school. But seeing her like that was too much and I just ran, right into Lydia's arms and into our marriage. When my grandmother died, they put her to rest in the Bronx, where her parents and her twin sister, who had died at birth, were already interred. But there was no headstone for her. There was no indication that Clara was there with them. My parents didn't have the money to get her a proper headstone. But now I did. Criss and I went out and bought a marble headstone for my grandmother's gravesite. I think that little trip made a big impression on him. All the other guys were buying expensive clothes and fancy cars with their newfound wealth, and I was buying a gravestone. After a few weeks with us, Criss Lend was amazed by our appeal. It was like we had hypnotized the audience, he'd say. You can go out there and say, we're going to lift the whole building up, and these fans would go and do it. It's true, we did have an unreal amount of control over the fans. It bordered on mania. After a concert in the Midwest, we discovered that someone had broken into our dressing room and stolen my entire outfit. My boots, my costume, my gloves, all gone. The cops thought they might have a lead, so they tracked this guy to his home. Outside his door, the cops heard Black Diamond blasting from his stereo. He didn't answer their knocks, so they busted the door down and there he was, sitting in a big chair, dressed in my costume and makeup, downing a beer and watching Kiss videos on his TV. Around the same time, people started coming backstage with their sick kids in wheelchairs. These kids would be dying of cancer or other diseases and their parents somehow thought that we were superheroes and we could cure them by laying hands on them. So we'd hug them and sign autographs and pose for pictures. The next time we hit town they'd show up again, but 1 or 2 of them would be missing. They didn't make it. It would break my heart. I would go into the bathroom and cry my fucking eyes out. Eventually I told Bill, you've got to stop this. I'm not God. It's much too draining for me to do this. Just being on the road constantly took its toll. I couldn't handle the constant moving around and the loneliness. So one way to combat that was to destroy shit. It's a rock and roll cliche, but it's true. We started out doing simple stuff, like attaching hundreds of feet of cable to our room TVs and throwing them off the roof of the Continental Hyatt House on the Sunset Strip in El-A. Our techs had a lot of tools with them on the road and we put them to good use. One time Ace and I were next door to each other and we wanted to be able to go back and forth between rooms, so we took a sledgehammer and broke through the wall and created our own connecting door. At one point I got so crazy on the road that I thought I was a Green Beret and that people were out to get me, so I started wearing camouflage outfits and carrying a cool sawed-off BB shotgun. We were at the Peachtree Hotel in Atlanta with those huge curved glass windows. I was shooting all kinds of stuff around the room with my BBS, but then I shot at the window and the whole thing exploded. It was like a bomb had gone off in the room. They actually had to close the floor down. To top me, I guess, Ace brought a crossbow on tour. Around that time I began to make a game out of stealing huge paintings from the hotel lobby. I'd wait for the manager or the desk clerks to walk away, and then one of the crew guys and I would heist the painting, rush it out of the lobby, and throw it into one of our trucks. Ace didn't even bother stealing the artwork. He'd walk through the lobby, pull out an arrow, and shoot it right through the paintings on the wall. He got so out of control with that crossbow, eventually we had to take it away from him. It was always fun to bust Criss lens balls. One time we were staying in a hotel with a beautiful golf course behind it. Ace and I got drunk with Eddie Ballandes, one of our bodyguards, and we decided to fuck with Criss. So we broke into his rental car, released the brake, and rolled it down the hill onto the golf course. That sucker destroyed greens, knocked down trees, did every kind of damage that could be done to a golf course. That night we stayed in the room and laughed all night long. When the sun came out, the cops found the car, saw that it had been rented to a Criss lend, and we had to pay the damages. Eventually we got such a bad rep that Criss was forced to put down a $10,000 deposit against any damages that we might incur. A lot of that was because of the shit that Ace and I and Eddie would pull. We had heard legendary stories of Keith Moon's pranks and we were striving to top him. We began by simply flooding the toilets and sinks so that the water would cascade down to the lower floors. Then we graduated to cherry bombs and M80s. Eddie somehow figured out how to hook them up so that you could light the fuse and throw them down the toilet. He'd rig up 3 cherry bombs with extra long fuses, and by the time we got to our car, they had exploded, destroyed the pipes, and flooded the hotel. Our all-time greatest prank was pulled on Gene. I came up with the idea and enlisted the whole band, even Bill. The idea was to have Fritz, who was then serving as my drum tech and whom Gene always tormented, get dressed up in one of Gene's old costumes and makeup. Near the end of our last number, I was going to switch places with Fritz and I'd wait backstage as Fritz took up the drumming. It could work because Fritz was a good drummer and he knew all our songs. Plus Fritz would be 60 feet in the air, and through all the fireworks, Gene would never realize that it was Fritz in his costume. So near the end of Black Diamond, we made the switch. Fritz threw in an extra beat and Gene looked up at the drums and just stared at Fritz with his mouth open. It was like he saw his doppelganger. I was backstage, pissing my pants. Gene then looked away and shook his head as if to say, "Did I just see that?" Then he looked over to Paul and Ace, and they both looked non-committal. When Gene looked back up at Fritz, I told Fritz to start giving him the tongue move. Now Gene was flipping out. Meanwhile, Ace and Paul were playing like there was nothing wrong. We ended the song and Gene looked up at Fritz one last time, dropped his bass, and almost fell off the stage. They had to catch him. Then I rushed up and put my arm around him. "Great fucking show, man," I smiled. We took our bows and Gene was still in total shock. "I think I'm losing my mind," he said. "I saw myself on the drums." "How can that be?" I said innocently. "I was up there." "I have to talk to Gooey about this," he said, and got into the limo with Bill. We were playing in Providence, so they had a long ride back to the city. About halfway home, Gene was so freaked out that Bill had to spill the beans and tell Gene about the prank. I don't think Gene spoke to anybody for a week. On September 25th we began recording Rock and Roll Over, our follow-up to Destroyer, at the Nanuet Star Theater in Rockland County, an old theater that had been shuttered. I had gone on an all-night coke binge the night before, so for the first time in my career I missed a session, which didn't go down well with everyone else. Eddie Kramer was back producing, and I told him that we should record my drums in the upstairs bathroom to get a better sound. We could put a video feed up there so I could communicate with the control room. Of course, having a camera up there was going to interfere with me doing lines, so whenever I wanted to do a bump, I moved the camera away and pretended we were having technical difficulties. Then I'd shake it, and miraculously it would work again. I sang 2 songs on the album. One night, Paul played Hard Luck Woman for me when we were standing around the pool table on a break. "I love that fucking song," I said. "I'd do anything to sing that." "Well, I was thinking of Rod Stewart," Paul said. "Fuck Rod," I fumed. "Don't I have a raspy voice? Come on." Paul gave me the song, but while I was recording it he stood in the studio next to Kramer from the beginning to the end, constantly talking to me over the intercom. "No, more raspy. Speed it up there." I wanted to stab him in the forehead with a knife. Toward the end of the song, I broke away from Paul's direction and did some free, flowing soul stuff, and I think that's the best part of the song. I must have done something right. The song was released as our first single off that album, and it went to number 15. Years later, Garth Brooks covered it. Gene and Paul let me contribute one song to the album. But even then, they fucked around with it. My original version of Baby Driver, a song I had written with Stan Penridge, was very cool. But these pricks had to go in and change it around. I never fucked with their original songs. They were like 2 Gestapo agents, always exerting their will. Later they even had the balls to say that they rearranged the song but didn't take credit for it so that the fans would think that everybody in the band was as creative as everybody else. With the album completed, we got ready to go back out on the road, naturally. But first we flew out to LA to tape Paul Lindy's Halloween TV special. My mother was thrilled. Paul Lindy was her favorite comedian. My mother loved gay people, and she thought he was the funniest. We were a little out of place on the show, with guests like Margaret Hamilton, Tim Conway, Florence Henderson, Betty White, and Donnie and Marie Osmond, but it should have been a wake-up call. We were rapidly leaving the rock and roll rebel label behind us and winding up as Hollywood Pablum. We were back on the road by the end of November, a tour that would last until April of 1977. There's just no way to overstate what a bizarre circus a Kiss tour was. We were staying at a fancy hotel in Ontario once when Billy Miller, one of our road managers, got a dispatch on his walkie-talkie from Big John, one of our security guys. "Ace is small," Big John said. That was the road crew's code for Ace is drunk. It seemed that Ace got smashed and was convinced that tiny green men had entered his brain and made him small. They put Ace to bed, but a few minutes later they heard a German shepherd barking its head off. Then there was the sound of glass breaking. By then everyone on the floor had woken up. Suddenly, Ace's door flew open and Ace ran out of his room in his underwear screaming, "He's getting me! He's shooting me!" It turned out that Ace had put on a sound effects record before he had passed out, and when the guns started firing, he thought they were real. Does this sound like a madhouse or what? We were all crazy in our own way, but that didn't stop our juggernaut. From 1976 to 1978 we made more than $17 million from record sales alone, and more than $7 million from touring, not counting merchandise. Suddenly we were getting awards, too. In 1976 and 1977 I won the Circus Magazine Drummer of the Year award. The first year I gave my award to Lydia. The next year Belushi got it. But the award that was dearest to my heart was the People's Choice Award for Beth. Of course, we were touring at the time, but the guys let Lydia fly out to L.A. and accepted for us on the telecast. They had hooked up a satellite link to where we were, and even though we knew we had won, Bill told us to act surprised. After we waved at the camera, Lydia was brought on stage in L.A. and she picked up the actual hardware. Halfway into the tour we finally realized our long, sought, after dream. On February 17, 1977, we played the mecca of our dreams, Madison Square Garden. As soon as I got the tour schedule, I called my mother to tell her that we were going to be at Message. The day of the show, all four of us were scared shitless. It hit us when we walked backstage and saw all those photos of Sinatra and Ali. This was the world's greatest arena. I think I threw up twice before the show. Paul was climbing the walls. You could cut the energy with a knife. Bill was trying to keep people away from our dressing rooms. He was a nervous wreck, too. Part of the reason we were nervous was that the sound sucked at the garden. We were disappointed at sound check because the room was so dead. It wasn't made for concerts. You either get nothing back, or the sound bounced off that back wall and came right back at you. And the Teamsters were a nightmare. My crew hated them. You couldn't even take a pen up on that stage, they had to carry it up for you. My drum tech told me that it was taking them hours to set up because they'd carry one cymbal at a time. Who's going to tell the Teamsters what the fuck to do, though? Before the show, I put one single red rose in each of the other guys' rooms, from me to them. The note said, "Let's have a great show. I love you, Peter." Right before we put on our makeup, I went to see Gene. "We're going out to play the garden," I said. "Son of a bitch, man, you said it so many times." He chuckled. When I got up behind the drums, I scanned the audience and I found my folks. We started to play and tears were streaming down my mom's face. Even my dad was all teared up. This was the one thing that I wanted more than anything else in the world, to be on that stage and see my mom and dad watch me play. I started bawling and my makeup started to run down the sides of my face. It's funny, no matter what age you reach, you're always still trying to please your parents. We never had money, but they let me pursue my dream. This was something I could give back to them, to make them feel that all that sacrifice was worth it. My mother was always so proud of me. She would actually go up to Gene after a show and say, "You know, if my son leaves the band, there will be no band. He makes the band great. Without a great drummer, there's no great band." Gene would say, "I guess you're right, Mrs. Criss," but he'd look like he wanted to choke her. But Bill would always take it up for her. "You are absolutely right, Mrs. Criss," he'd tell her. "Your son is the heartbeat of the band." Then he'd give her a hug. 3 days after the garden show, we came back down to reality. We were finishing our show at the Nassau Coliseum on Long Island when it was time for me to levitate. By then we were using a scissors lift to get me up. Those things were not balanced, so sure enough the platform tilted to the left and half of my drums were hanging off it. We just played the garden, and now we look like idiots, I fumed afterward. I was pissed. That night I went to Ashley's to chill and I hung out with Boss Skaggs until closing time. I got home at daybreak, drunk and wired, and I wanted to have sex with Lydia but she refused. So I grabbed the keys and stormed out of the house and went to the garage down the street where I kept my Camaro. The attendant brought me my car and then turned around to take care of other business. I was so fucked up that I got into the car and accidentally floored it and smashed into the wall of the garage. Then I put it into reverse and floored it again and hit the rear wall. I kept repeating this until the car caught on fire. Lucky for me, One of my neighbors was getting his car and he pulled me up. By then the attendant had called the cops. I was sitting on a bench with my nose broken, bleeding profusely, and I hadn't even left the garage yet. Somehow I was conscious enough to tell the attendant to call Bill and have him to rush over to the garage. The cop arrived just before Bill. "Peter Criss from Kiss," the cop said. "What the hell did you do?" He looked into the car with his flashlight and he saw my 38, my drugs, and a switchblade. Just then Bill came. Bill took the cop to the side, but I could hear them talking. "There's a gun in the car. Some drugs too. But since he didn't hurt nobody but himself, get this stuff out of here in 5 minutes," and I didn't see anything. "But you owe me," the cop told Bill. Bill promised him lifetime passes to any Kiss show. I had to go to the hospital, so Bill called Lydia and asked her to clean out the car while we went to Bellevue. By the time Lydia arrived at the hospital, I was lying on a gurney in the hallway with 2 black eyes and a busted nose. They put a bandage on my broken nose and sent me home with a big bottle of Percodan. I had never taken Percodan before, but they were a revelation. A couple of them with champagne was a killer high. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It took Belushi to introduce me to the pleasures of Percodan. I was back at the brownstone, healing in bed, when John came over to visit. "How you feeling, Peter?" he said softly. "Oh, Johnny, I can't breathe." "I'm fucked up," I said. He was anxious to hear the blow account of the accident, and as I related it to him, his eyes wandered to my nightstand. "So what did the doctor give you?" he asked. "I don't know what they're called. Some pills for the pain." He picked up the bottle. "Wow, Percodan." His eyes lit up. "These fucking things are dynamite. Do you mind?" "No, take what you want." I didn't even finish the sentence and John had emptied the rest of the bottle into his mouth. "What ya got to drink?" he mumbled. I motioned toward the bar and he grabbed a bottle of tequila and guzzled it down with those pills. In seconds he was flying on top of the buzz he had when he came over. After a few minutes, John said he had to leave to meet Dan. "John, you're really fucked up," I said. "Why don't you hang out a little longer, and I'll get out of bed and we'll watch a little TV." "Ah, stay in bed, I'll be fine." We said goodbye and watched him stumble out of the room. But he couldn't deal with our spiral staircase. Seconds later, we heard boom, 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 boom. I jumped out of bed. Lydia yelled down the stairs, "Are you all right, John?" "Yeah, I'm fine," he mumbled back. Then we heard the front door slam and we could hear him screaming for a cab in the street. If Belushi likes these things so much, they must be cool, I thought as I went back to bed. The next day I called my doctor and got the prescription refilled. Before I knew it, I was addicted to them.